Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss all things sci and paranormal through the lens of remote viewing. I'm Brett Stewart, your host, accompanied by my co-hosts, Emily and David. Today we're discussing a rather famous piece of film of Bigfoot, and we're going to be unpacking what's really going on with it, if it's genuine and authentic, if it's a man in a suit. I know Emily's done a lot of research for us, and we're going to look into the backstory of how the film was captured, about the people there, and then ultimately we're going to go into our remote viewing data, because with David and I were tasked this blind. We didn't know what the task was, and we got some really exciting, some really exciting data for you. So we're going to focus primarily on the life form in this main episode. Make sure to stay around for after hours, because we had some other things that are really interesting. Emily, why don't you start us off with your research about this film of Bigfoot? Most people have probably seen this, and if you haven't, definitely do a quick Google search. I think it's called the Patterson film. But maybe you give us a bit of a background on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So this week, I have sent our remote viewers on a journey to look at the Patterson-Gimlin films. That's the name of the film. For short, sometimes we refer to it as PGF. A lot of the researchers in this field do. And what it is arguably the most famous Bigfoot footage of all time. And if you just go onto your favorite search browser and just type in Patterson-Gimlin Film, I'm sure there's tons of videos online. You can go and watch it for yourself. It's not very long. It's about a minute. We're getting into the exact length here in a moment. But it was filmed back in 1967. And what's so unique about this film is that it's, at that time, it wouldn't be that amazing if we looked at it through the lens of 2022 or modern film technology, because of course the special effects are so fantastical that we can create almost anything we can imagine through computer graphics and costume art and all these things. And so it doesn't seem all that special, but when you actually put yourself in the shoes of the people who were around in 1967 and look at what was actually possible both to do on film with costume art and all of those things, it's very interesting how difficult this would have been in terms of what they're calling a hoax or a fake. And when we say that, what we really mean is the film is genuine. There's no serious individual who's looked at this film who says the film itself is fake. Where people have contention, or where the contentious issues come up, is individuals say, oh, well, this was a guy in a suit, a guy in a costume. And the argument is between that and it not being a guy in a costume, being a genuine creature or life form that we actually see in the film. So the film is just, as it appears, an interesting phenomenon. And so we'll be getting into why people think one or the other and some of the different reasons behind that. Let me just run down a little bit more of the top level data. So the location it was filmed at is a place called Bluff Creek, and that's in Northern California, USA. It was filmed on a Friday afternoon in October. It's going to be important when we get into the technical aspects of the film processing itself. The film was a Kodachrome 2, which is the type of film reel it was filmed on, also important for later discussion, and had a length of 954 frames. It's assumed that it was filmed at 16 frames per second, which is about a minute of real time, and it's very commonly played back at 18 frames per second, which is about 53 seconds. So obviously not very long. And there's actually 5 or 6 parts to the film. Most people don't know that. The famous part, I believe, is part number 5. There's footage going into the famous part of the filmmakers riding horses through the stream. There are some other very short segments of the film that look accidental, also very difficult to fake. And then a short little clip at the end that is them chasing after the creature, I believe. Now, with all that being said, I have to admit that going into the research for this, I hadn't made up my mind either way in terms of the film. I kind of wanted it to be a genuine film, a genuine encounter, although I understood there was a lot of criticism, so I hadn't really made up my mind. But I'm curious to know, David, do you have any, going into this before we did the RV work, what was your feeling on this film?
I'd seen the film. I think everybody's probably seen the film, right? And I thought it's just too good. It has to be fake. It's too clear. It must just be a person in a gorilla costume, right? Nobody ever gets footage like this. And as you were saying, with modern effects and stuff, it's easy. We're in the habit of going, oh, it's fake, it's fake. Anybody could have faked that. So that was always my assumption. So when we got feedback for our remote viewing work, it absolutely blew my mind, because what I got in my session was not people faking a video with a gorilla suit, not by a long stretch.
Yeah, I have come to a very similar conclusion in that there's a lot of compelling evidence for it not being a person in a gorilla suit. Brett, what's your take on it before we did our remote viewing? What was your feeling on this film?
Yeah, I'd seen it a really long time ago. I remember, I don't know where I found it online, but there was a stabilized version of it that I came across a really long time ago. I said, "Oh, that's a really cool scene right there." But my impressions, well, I've two things on that. Number one, my first impression of this, and when I saw it, I just, come on, it's a film crew making a movie. Of course, they're going to have the ability to fake a Bigfoot, I don't know, for publicity or something like that. So it's not outside the realm of possibility. It's more of the Occam's razor. Huh, is it a unknown creature that no one ever has seen ever? It's this mysterious thing. Or is it that on the film set for a movie, they record a guy in an outfit and make it look real, as real as they can? Occam's razor would suggest that it's the latter. So that's where I kind of landed. However, I think my second point on this, and I'll be going into this more likely in after hours. Uh, I actually have run this task about 10 years ago for my original remote viewing mentor, who was the training and operations officer for the military remote viewing program. And he gave me this task when I was doing my original training with him. And interestingly, I got the exact same thing a decade ago on this film that I got for you. So it'll be interesting to go into that.
Interestingly, Brett, you have also tasked me with this target in the past, which I believe was the same one that you did. It was topical search Sasquatch. Um, and I got some very similar things, which I look forward to discussing in the after hours section because it's pretty wild.
Yeah, and there's a cool thing when you have multiple sessions across a decade on the same topic, all returning the same information. It's a pretty good indicator that there's something here. At least that's the way I look at it. So just another data point.
So what's really interesting about both of your data points combined with my findings and my research on the actual feedbackable information, everything is in perfect alignment. And so it would be one thing just to have this RV data that corroborates sort of itself, but then when that overlays very nicely onto the actual feedbackable data that you get when you scratch beneath the surface, and we'll get into, for the benefit of the listener, just the high level criticisms and why I don't think they're uh, correct, or perhaps why there's maybe some more nuance to them. Let me just very quickly run down. There's basically, for the listener, I summarize the criticisms of this particular film into three main categories. The first one is the filmmaker, Roger Patterson of Patterson-Gimlin. The other fellow's name was Bob or Robert Gimlin. The filmmaker Roger Patterson was really the main individual in the story. I don't want to downplay Bob Gimlin's involvement, but I believe Roger was the actual person holding the camera at the time of the filming and was really the driver of this film production. And a lot of the criticisms are actually ad hominem attacks of Roger's character. He had a checkered financial track record. He basically didn't pay all of his bills on time. He also was an aspiring documentarian who actually wanted to go out and film Sasquatch. So it's very easy to look at this and say, okay, well, here's an individual who basically wants to believe in Sasquatch. He goes out and tries to film it, and magically he does, right? It's a bit of a coincidence.
I think they call that motive.
Exactly. So that is a big criticism of Roger. Now, the next category of criticism is basically the guy in the costume criticism. And there's two main bits of information that come into play on this one. One is there was a costume rental company named Morris Costumes that claims to have sold the costume in the film to Roger Patterson. Now, that would seem like a smoking gun, right? Oh, here we have a costume rental company. They sold the suit to this individual, and then there's this film, and they claim that's the one in the film. They have not been able to reproduce the costume. One of the first things as a costume rental company you do when you get a costume is you get the pattern for the costume so you can make more copies of it. You don't ever just make one if you're in the business of renting out costumes. And so it's very strange that they can't produce the pattern, nor have they ever been able to produce a suit that looks anything like the one in the film. So their claims might be, well, at the very least, they're unproven. And they could have their own motivations for making these claims. If you're in the business of promoting costumes, it would be really great to tell people to associate yourself with a very popular film and say, hey, our costumes, they're part of this cool film. Come and buy costumes or rent them from us, right? So there's a mix of motivations there. And then there's actually an individual named Bob Hieronymus, not to be confused with Bob Kimlin, a different Bob, who claims to have actually been the individual in the suit. And the interesting thing there is there's videos of him online making the same walk as the character in the film. And I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but they affectionately refer to her as Patty. And I'll get into why they call the individual a her in a little bit. Patty, just from the fact that it's the Patterson-Gimlin film. But basically, this Bob Hieronymus character is doing the Bigfoot walk. And everyone's like, oh, there we go. There's a guy who admits to being in the costume. He's doing the walk. Case closed. Nothing to see here. The problem is that he didn't come out initially. He came out about this information after Roger Patterson had passed away. So there's no way for Roger to refute his claims, obviously. And the other aspect of this is it's entirely possible that Bob got in a costume from Morris Costumes, was filmed by Roger Patterson, and that isn't what we see in the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is a super interesting idea that I'd come across in my research. So all of these things could be true. If you put yourself in the shoes of Roger Patterson and you're making a film of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and you have a bunch of eyewitness encounters, which he did on audio tape, as a filmmaker, you want some visuals to go along with those things. And so what you would probably do is, back then they didn't have special effects in computer format with CGI. They would have gone ahead and maybe tried to do a recreation or a dramatization. It's entirely possible that Roger Patterson, being a filmmaker, created a dramatization that perhaps looked so ridiculous or absurd, he decided never to show it to anyone and never use it. And then subsequently actually made the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is genuine. So it's very important to understand multiple claims can be true. And I think this is a theme we're going to see in other topics we explore, where things aren't mutually exclusive. It's not like things are this way and not that way.
It would be infinitely synchronistic and almost ironic if part of what they were trying to film was their own version of a Bigfoot just for a film. And then they just so happen to, at the same time, be out in the woods where a real supposed Bigfoot happened to also be. It's just the synchronicity of a lifetime, which, again, going back to before I did any RV work on this, is unbelievable to me. That's Occam's razor just shuts that down way too fast. But Occam's razor isn't foolproof either. There are really amazing synchronicities that do happen. Could this be one? Well, we'll find out with RV data. At least that's one lens. But it would be quite funny, I suppose, and almost like a universal joke. Like the universe is playing a joke on the filmmaker. Oh, you're making a film about it. Let me show you a real Bigfoot. The ultimate irony.
I think you can look at it another way, though, in that the phenomenon resists being recorded, right? There's always, oh, my phone was out of battery, or it went away when I went to get my camera, or the cryptid walked behind the tree and then it was gone and then I couldn't see. There's always, and people still have the experience. So maybe this is another manifestation of that resistance to being recorded, right? That it appears and allows you to take a beautiful video of it, but it does so in a circumstance where everybody is going to believe it's fake. that's just the same kind of sense of humor, I think.
So Roger Patterson apparently did not have a lack of self-awareness and a lack of a sense of humor. I believe he was quoted something along the lines of, at his deathbed, "I'm the worst person in the world this could have happened to." And if you think about a person who genuinely wants to share the phenomenon with the world and then realizes how horribly the optics of the situation look, it's just like maddeningly frustrating that it's a real thing and yet it looks so bad because of his character and all of his issues and all these situations that are part of his life. So I don't think the irony was lost on the filmmakers either, which is an interesting data point. I'll get into the very final category of criticism. I don't think it's a very big one, but I should address it here, and that's the Kodachrome film itself. Now, it was filmed on a Friday afternoon, and this is back in the days of when you had to actually take film to a development process and have it processed so you could show it to people. And people are very critical of the film development timeline, and they say this thing was filmed on a Friday afternoon. All of the places you could have taken the Kodachrome film were closed Friday afternoon by the time they could have brought the film somewhere. And yet they managed to have their first showing on Sunday, the following Sunday, 2 days later. Therefore, it's impossible for this not to be fake. Somehow that logic follows. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to our world knows that not everything works as it officially works. In other words, yes, a store can say our opening hours are this to this, but for the right amount of money or the right amount of connections, you can get things done that are not official. And there were some financiers behind this film that had a lot of money and a lot of connections. And so if you genuinely thought you had this once in a lifetime film and you had money, I think it's zero chance you couldn't have found someone to come in after hours for a few $100 back then. So for the sake of completeness, I thought I'd cover this one major criticism because it does seem to be fairly prominent in various forums and discussions online. I personally don't think it's valid in any way, shape, or form. It just doesn't make any sense, but there it is. So I want to now introduce you to the reasons why I think the film is genuine in that there is a real unknown origin creature. We'll probably uncover the origins in our RV data, but to the sort of a lay person, they're looking at this film, they don't know anything about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, they're going to see a very unusual sight. So there's actually two aspects of this that I was convinced by. One was the film itself. So the film itself is the evidence that I think we need to look at because we have it. And I think this is a theme that will continue in our other research is when you have hard data, you can take ad hominem attacks, as basically a personal attack on an individual's character, into consideration, but ultimately you have to look at what hard data you have. And in this case, the hard data is the film. The film itself has various segments, and I won't go into huge details on this because it's very lengthy research that's been done on it. There are segments in there where the camera holder actually pushed the trigger, the record button, momentarily while chasing after the creature. And there were 2 frames. There's no way to actually record 2 frames intentionally. It's almost like a misfire on the play stop button while the camera is rotating while the individual's tripping over a log. I mean, to fake that in the same film reel as you've got yourself riding in on horseback and then this creature in this most famous film, that would be a very challenging thing to do. And it's in the middle of the film reel.
We're going to put the link in the show notes to that analysis of the film from, because film video predates me. I don't know anything about that stuff, but I understand there's a really lengthy analysis that people can go and wade through if that's their idea of fun.
Right, so that's something that the listener can dive into more deeply on their own, but suffice it to say that the film itself is very interesting and would be very, very challenging to splice together in terms of if you thought about having a person in a costume and it wasn't a spontaneous event, there would be staging, you'd have to put the suit on, you'd have to back up, you'd have to get the angles right, the person would be maybe doing multiple takes. It would be very challenging to orchestrate that perfect set of events with both sides of the film having these very spontaneous moments. The other category of also on the film, other category of information that's very convincing to me at least, is the biomechanical and anatomical features of the creature on the film. And there's a number of those things that maybe if you looked at one aspect, you could sort of say, well, it's hard to say if that could be a person. But then you put all these aspects together and there's not a single human being that would match this description on the planet. First and foremost, the thing that jumps out to most people looking at the film, if they study it carefully, is that the creature actually has pendulous breast tissue. And that is the indication that very likely this individual is a female. At least that's what people are assuming from that. And at the time, now in modern times, again, we have to put ourselves back into 1967. That would have been very, very hard to mimic in those times. This was really before the advent of modern spandex, silicone, all the stretchy movie things that we have now. It's a very difficult thing to fake. There's also leg muscle that is apparent on the leg as it moves, meaning that the muscle has to be immediately below the fur. So again, if you think of a person in a costume with maybe even street clothes on, they very likely would not actually have that muscle flexing visible sort of through the fur. It would look more like a shaggy carpet hanging off the individual. And even the fur itself back then, there were some costume experts that have looked at this film and said that it would have been more like wearing bits of carpet or like a fur coat. If they had made a suit back then that looked like this, it would not have had the stretchy effects that the modern special effects people can create. Also, there's a very interesting taper on the skull. So if you look at the eyes of the creature and then you follow the skull up behind that, it tapers off almost immediately. So there's no sort of room for a larger brain like humans have. And then there's a sagittal crest, which is sort of a bit of a bump or a spike in the middle of the head that's apparent. And that skull shape is very difficult to recreate in humans. Apparently, filmmakers at the time struggled very much to create apes or convincing looking apes in terms of costumes that humans could get into, because you just can't change the shape of the skull without scaling up the head. And in this particular case, if the head were scaled up, then the eyes would be out of alignment. You think of a person in a suit with the eyes out of alignment, walking through a creek with all sorts of brambles and stuff. They'd be tripping over everything. So that's very difficult to subtract from the skull, where a human head would go up as opposed to back, if that makes sense.
So what you're saying is that this would have to be one of the most amazing costumes ever made in the history of costume making for the era, if this were to be faked.
Hands down, this would have been the number one costume of all time at that time, made by a person who can't afford to pay their bills.
And so therefore, that actually brings up, returning back to this idea of Occam's razor, is that if you look at the data, the actual facts that are there in the film, where is the suit? If this suit is so amazing, is so realistic that you can see muscle stretching underneath the fur, shouldn't it be on display for everyone to see as a masterpiece, as a work of art, as the most amazing, convincing thing ever created in that era? And yet it's not. And so that to me seems unlikely. I see why this is convincing to you, Emily.
It's sort of like, if it's so easy to fake, why wasn't it faked a million times over so convincingly back then, right? It's like, oh, I can do that. It's like, okay, do it, but nobody did, right? And so that's it. Yeah, the biomechanical aspects to me are really huge. When I started looking into the details, I won't go into all of them, but there's also arm and leg lengths and joints, the location of those, very unusual proportions for humans. Is there a human on the planet that has these? Yes, but if you start adding all these things together, it's 1 in 10 billion chance that one single human has all these physical biomechanical properties. And then it's like, well, where is that human? Because that would be the strangest looking person on the planet. And did these two characters who filmed it have access to the strangest looking person on the planet for a short 1-minute video and then hid them away, or somehow they're no longer found? It's pretty unlikely, I think, if you really look into the details. So that's my assessment of the actual film itself. I'd like to move ahead and get into some of the data. David, did you want to start and share with the listener what you uncovered in your data with respect to the creature or the subject in the film.
Yeah, I mean, this was the data that really made me revise my opinion on this and say, wow, it wasn't just a person in a suit. And now I've heard your summary about all the reasons that people give for it not being a person in a suit. I'm more comfortable with the fact that my data say what they do. So this was a very cheerful and relaxed kind of person. They didn't feel like a big shouty, angry ape. Certainly nothing like that. But well, right from the off, I described them as composed, unconflicted, and they know what they're about. But very quickly, things started to get weird. The first sign was a really terrible smell, which I described as anaerobic, unpleasant, organic, or rotting, which I know terrible smells are quite commonly associated with these sorts of phenomena, right? Um, and then I identified that it was a life form that's like a thing with a sense of personal identity, like a human. But when I looked at that, there's a huge part missing from their identity. There's a void in their sense of self, I've written, and we can get into more detail on that later because I did dig down on it. But right from the off, it was like, this is not quite normal. Um, so then I said, this is a person in the past who walked a very different path to us today. Haha. That they're out of their usual context. Um, I got the idea this is a story and that it's all over with now. That this life form is kind of like mixed up with something that just isn't their normal thing. They're out of context, I guess video appearances are not Bigfoot's day-to-day occupation. So I got quite a lot of data on the narrative and like control of the narrative and this storytelling aspect. But maybe Brett, do you want to say what you got about the physical aspect of the life form first?
Yeah, so I also picked up on the life form in my session, and there's two different aspects to this life form. I'm gonna only discuss right now the kind of nuts and bolts of what you'd see at the site first, and then, like David said, maybe later we'll talk about what's behind it, or the driver behind what's going on here. But I did get a life form. I got someone that resembled a person that was walking away. Ultimately, the way I perceived them, though, was something was off of them, just like David had described, except the way that I perceived it is it was like it was a life form that was there, but wasn't there. Is that it had somehow a non corporeal and corporeal form at the same time. I didn't quite understand initially what I was perceiving, but the big analogy was it's kind of like something is at the long end of a tunnel. Like imagine someone is on the other side of the planet and they are showing up here. Their image of them is showing up here in your local space and you see them. But are they really here? Yes and no. The image of them is here, but their actual self is not. And so I was describing this idea of a life form that was like an echo image. It's like a shimmering mirage of something else that is generating it there at the site. A great description for it is it's like I'm seeing a ghost. It's something that is not necessarily alive in the traditional sense, but it's something that arises or comes to being, but then can also dissipate as well. And so the physical attributes of this, though, is I described it. It's funny. My descriptor is it's like it's wearing a flowy dress. It's like has some sort of exterior that's like wavy and soft and flowy. I just thought it was a dress when I when I remote viewed it, but it makes sense as far as what once I got feedback. Oh, okay. Well, there's the fur that I'm describing that's flowy. So very unusual type of life form, but ultimately I described it walking away. I described it with kind of one arm in front of the other in a snapshot, and the actual I got that there was like a gesturing. I'm not sure. I have to revisit the film, but I think if I recall correctly, it looks back during the film and then continues walking. And in my remote viewing data, I got this idea. It was almost like there was a gesturing that was going on with this life form to follow it. Like, you probably shouldn't, but ooh, wouldn't it be interesting if you did follow me? That's what I was picking up in the remote viewing session. And when I saw the film, I was like, I wonder if that's what that actually was when it would turned around and had this kind of stride. It's like, maybe you should come after me. And I don't know if anyone did, but yeah, that's my general description of the life form.
I wanted to add to Brett's story that, in fact, I didn't mention this earlier, but Bob Gimlin, who wasn't the person holding the film, actually did chase after the creature. So the creature walked up the side of the embankment and off into the woods. Bob Gimlin was not a layperson when it came to tracking. He was experienced with tracking big game in the forest. And he said that he went into the forest. Mysteriously, the tracks just stopped at the edge of undisturbed brush that was way too deep for any creature. And he's used to seeing large creatures move through brush. They bend things and break things. It just seemed to vanish. So that does corroborate with the feedback we have.
Well, it's interesting because what I described, the end of this narrative in the remote viewing session, is the life form, the illusion or appearance of this life form walks away. It's beckoning someone to follow. And then where does it go? Well, it's being lifted up and away by something else. And it just disappears. It dematerializes, which I thought was really weird data when I was kind of like, how does a person just like, okay, well, maybe we're dealing with some woo here. But I described it as it just walked away and then dematerialized as it walked away. It was after it went a certain distance. And there's something else that was doing that, but I think we might discuss that in the after hours, the details of it.
I got some descriptors. Your flowy dress reminded me of I was doing a physical profile of this thing. The very first place my pen was drawn to was like below the feet. So I'm kind of going, what? Why is this? Whatever. Okay. So I'm shaking my foot around, going, what kind of shoes are they wearing? Because you learn a lot about a person by their shoes, right? I do that regularly. And it felt really strange. I thought it was weird shoes, which I don't know, maybe you could leap on that and say, oh, see, I told you it was a costume. I mean, that's my interpretation, because the feet were just very heavy, but they were kind of top heavy. It felt like not having shoes on, but then having a weight on top of your foot. And then I thought, I'm kind of getting carried away with all of this, trying to work out what these weird shoes are. I'm sure it's not that important, so I moved on and left it. But it was an odd feeling of being barefoot, but having a heavy weight to the foot, which may be my subconscious mind having a funny little joke. I also got a gesture. I don't know if it was the follow me, but they had their hand held out flat. I said it was like over something. Maybe I thought it was another person, but they weren't really doing anything. They were just holding their hand out. And I said, oh, I had an AOL that it was, like the Pope or a priest or someone holding out their hand and doing a blessing. It was like a gesture, significant, meaningful thing, but they weren't, like touching anything in doing that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I should also mention, there were footprints in the creek bed reported by the filmmakers. So we do have physical impressions, and I think we might get into some speculation later as to how, if the data that we have here from Brett, how do we reconcile hearing that this thing sort of dematerialized with it leaves physical evidence as footprints and broken branches and so on. And obviously, there are many Bigfoot encounters where people report physical things changing in the environment with respect to the foliage, the trees, the footprints, and how all that ties back into our data. So we'll probably get into that a little bit in the after hours as well. Brett, did you have anything else you wanted to add to this in terms of the life form itself?
Yeah, so I got some other data associated with it that is a little unexpected in relation to the feedback that we're looking at this film of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, whichever label you choose. But as this life form was walking away, in my remote viewing work data, there's a symbol that I draw for a death event, very specifically when a life form stops existing. And it's typically in my remote viewing work, I draw it symbolically as a spiraling up and away. And whenever I get that, the impression immediately that comes along with that is that, oh, someone has just deceased. They've stopped existing, and their energy or something is leaving that body and going somewhere else. And that's exactly what I got with this life form after it walked away. It beckoned someone to follow, almost a little bit to the chagrin of it. It's like, oh, maybe you should follow, but you probably can't. And then it walked away, but then it just died. And I'm like, well, wait, it just died. What's causing the death? And everything I got at this point, it just turned into this description of like a transcendent event. Like I'm describing a religious figure like Buddha or Jesus dematerializing out of physical reality and ascending into the heavens of the ether. And it was almost like they exited stage left on physical reality. But it didn't mean they stopped existing. It's just they went somewhere else that was non-physical. And so therefore, through the lens of this event, it makes me believe that my session is telling me that the life form itself materialized and then has the ability to dematerialize. And it just no longer exists. And where it goes, well, I guess we'll find out in after hours.
I got religious stuff as well while I was doing my meta-spiritual probe, which, will often say things like, oh, they go to church, but they mostly just go for the company and the tea and cake and stuff. Or I once did a session on that lady who threw herself off Niagara Falls in a barrel, and the response I got there was like, this is not directly helpful to her spiritual evolution. So it's an interesting lens to look at life forms through. So I do this for a life form here, and immediately my eye and my head around my eye starts hurting. And that's happened not very many times before, but there's something funny going on when that happens. It actually reminded me of Joseph Smith. When I remote viewed Joseph Smith, I got like zapped. I felt spiritually they were poetical, whatever that means. And then I wrote, this is not your normal human life or incarnation. This is something else.
So I know we're talking about some pretty wild stuff. Definitely a lot of woo going on here. I want to mention the awareness we have. Obviously, there are many people who study Sasquatch and Bigfoot. And within that community, there's, let's just say, a huge divergence of opinion as to what Bigfoot is and what Sasquatch is. I personally have an interest in this topic, and I've spent hundreds of hours listening to eyewitness or experiencer encounters. And in doing so, one of the things you hear is there's a lot of things potentially going on, but there's definitely cases where experiencers say that the tracks just stopped. They're following the tracks through a frozen lake in the middle of winter in the snow, and they just disappear. Or there's hunting, tracking dogs trying to find the trail of this creature, and they just lose their track. They lose their way. And so there is definitely a lot of evidence that corroborates some of the woo we're talking about here. And I want to challenge those out there who might be screaming right now at their podcasts and saying it's a not they're the people who know it's not a guy in a suit, but they're saying no, it's a physical creature, it's a wood ape. How dare you say that it has all these other properties? In fact, some of the people who have done the deep dive analysis of the film would probably take exception to us to saying that it's more than just a creature in the woods. And I challenge those individuals to actually look at the data of all the eyewitness encounters. I know eyewitness encounters have their own issues, they're anecdotal, etc. But there are many cases where these creatures just seem to disappear. There's other strange aspects to these creatures' appearances with respect to orbs or smaller UFOs, and we might get into that as well later in the show. But the people looking into Bigfoot itself really need to look at all the evidence and not just the evidence that fits their particular narrative, because there are some very, very strange things going on with this creature, with these creatures, that are much beyond what the people that think this is just a creature that lives in the woods, like a deer or a moose or a bear or something. There's definitely something very unique about this particular creature.
Yeah, it's not a normal life, and therefore wouldn't have necessarily a normal death event too, I suppose. And I describe it in the work, it's almost like this thing is on marionette strings. Something else is moving it around. So when it ceases to exist, then all that's really happening is the thing that's creating it there is deciding to no longer create it there. So it is a suit, actually. It's just not the suit that you thought.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Brett. I think that this even ties back into the theory that I proposed right at the beginning, that the person who did dress up in a costume for Roger Patterson actually could have done so and could have been filmed by Roger Patterson while simultaneously not disproving the genuine nature of the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. So there oftentimes, I believe, are multiple competing or concurrent phenomena going on with respect to even Bigfoot that are just because there are these Bigfoots or these Sasquatches that do have this property. We're not saying they all do. We're leaving space for the, I call it the wood ape, but basically the large hominid that's like yet to be discovered in the forest. We're not saying those aren't out there. We're saying there's more to this than just that. And a lot of the arguments could be solved by leaving space for multiple phenomenon going on that seem to maybe be lumped into one thing, but are actually many different things. And there's space for all of these things to be true. I think we have to go into all of these explorations with that in mind.
I think it's important also to state that we only looked with our remote viewing data at one singular event. Our remote viewing data is just pointing to this film and the thing in that film. Does that mean that there aren't other phenomenon that exists? I don't know, but may presuppose that there is some sort of a physical just creature out there that exists in the really remote, distant land, and there's nothing really strange going on with it other than it's an unknown ape of some kind. The work doesn't say that. All we really can speak about is this is what our remote viewing data says about that film, and that is it. You can't extrapolate that, well, therefore all Bigfoots are this. It's not the way you'd use this data. So make sure to remember the context for where this was derived. It doesn't exclude anything else, it simply illuminates this particular instance.
So one final aspect I think we should look at is what were the motivations as part of the original tasking was what were the motivations of the filmmakers? And I know, David, you had some data in your RV session with respect to a little bit of the psychology speculated and a little bit of the mentality of the people actually making the film. Do you want to share that with the listener?
Yeah, I got some interesting stuff about the narrative and storytelling aspect of this. I said this takes place as famous, well-known, symbolic place, like a tourist attraction. This place has a proper noun, and then that from this place that there's a construction telling a story. So I'm going, okay, true story? Is this artificial or authentic? And I get that the goal is storytelling first. That it doesn't mean the content's not true, but this is being approached with a presentational priority, which, from what we know about the background of these guys, is accurate. The number one priority is to be compelling or engaging. So then I asked, what about the truth behind the story? Folk legends, bits and pieces of stories all cobbled together, made into a compelling narrative. Why are we doing this, then? What's the motive? Gotta be money, is it? Money, power, why are they doing this? And I get it's control of narrative around a particular topic, like putting a stake in the ground. So, if you tell the earliest, best Bigfoot story, everybody's going to be comparing their work to you. So now we have this film. I mean, I'm not a Bigfoot expert by any means, but I guess comparisons will be made with this. So why control the narrative? Are they hiding something? And they're creating something new. But I got the feeling that this is a kind of cynical thing. Their motives are not pure and love and light and rainbows and happiness.
It's interesting that the backstory is that they were actually documentarians trying to make a Bigfoot film. And you may have actually been remote viewing not just the making of this film, but the overall motive of what these people were about in the context of filmmaking in general, and the fact that they were actually trying to make a Bigfoot documentary.
Yeah, I think the tasking was to describe the main subject in the film, the reaction, intent, and mindset of the filmmakers, so that makes sense. I got just a little bit more stuff about this, which I think is maybe more about the film itself. Something happens outside. It is an alleged historical location of, well, now I know, Bigfoot. So we got this stake in the ground idea, and I had an AOL, or like a metaphor for this, of the way the early Christian church used to bulldoze pagan temples and build churches on top of them as a like symbolic replacing. And that's sort of a metaphor for what's happening here. That I guess there were all those stories, the folk stories. A lot of them would be folk stories, right? They're taking those stories and bulldozing them and saying, "Here's Bigfoot. This is what Bigfoot's like," which I guess is completely consistent with the goal of story building documentary project. So I'm like, is this maybe this is imposing an interpretation on history, or even attempting to create a new history? Entertainingly, I said, harmless. This is an offshoot, a branch, a dead end backwater of history. It doesn't sit in the main current.
Yeah, I think there's one thing in my data that corroborates what you're picking up here, and I just described that the life form itself is somewhat of a red herring to what's actually going on. It's like what's being seen is actually not the most significant thing that's going on here. There's something bigger than the thing that we're viewing. I think the fact that there's this religious aspect of it, it almost makes me wonder if some of the data of mine is also pertaining to the aftermath of this film. And as a result of it getting out into the public awareness, it's like you could make an argument that some individuals are so invested in this being a lost creature from this film that it almost becomes somewhat of a religious belief, because it is a belief, it is faith that that's what this is. But my remote viewing work here is saying, well, that's a red herring. That's completely not the most significant thing here. In fact, this is an artifice. This actually is not what you think it is. It's something much more wild, but it's not what you think it is.
In the after hours, I'm really looking forward to delving into the psychology of the physical aspect of Bigfoot. But I think it's going to take us from the nuts and bolts into the stranger stuff in a way that makes a surprising amount of sense, considering all the subject matter that we have here. I've also got some session work which did quite some time ago that you guys won't have seen on what is it? It's the Nepalese forest shaman teacher called Banjakri, and it's kind of a yeti, and it abducts children and it trains them to be shamans unless they're naughty, in which case it kind of like hurts them and throws them out or kills them or eats them or feeds them to its wife or something. I can't remember the legend exactly, but it's not an entirely positive set of folklore. And we did a monitored live Cowboys session looking at this thing, and it was a very interesting session. So perhaps we'll pull some data out of that, which ties in with some of the stranger stuff that we've got to talk about.
It's interesting you describe the motivations of this other thing as being somewhat dark or evil, but I forgot to mention this earlier, is I did pick up on the intent of the life form. And I specifically got the phrase, it's not evil. That this thing isn't, it doesn't have negative malintent for others. It's just a little mischievous and perhaps misguided in what it's doing. It thinks that, oh yeah, this might be a fun little thing to do. Come follow me. It doesn't have any malintent though. I specifically got that it's not evil. So just another takeaway perhaps on the character of the being itself.
I also got that it wasn't evil. I said it was positive and pleasant and like so relaxed. It was like it was looking forward to lunch, was the analogy. You know, when you're just having a nice day and it's like, oh, what's for lunch? That was how it felt. There definitely wasn't any malice within the creature itself. I think the picture may be a little more complex elsewhere, but the actual physical end of things was there wasn't any negativity in that.
And in the after hours, I'm going to bring forth some examples of some of the eyewitness encounters I'm aware of, not to get into too many specifics, but just how some of that data that might seem a bit strange when you hear certain eyewitnesses speak ties into the things that Brett and David have talked about, specifically around these, what people would say, high woo, high strangeness, paranormal sort of aspects of the encounter. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with the listener.
So to wrap things up, I guess where we stand that based on this initial remote viewing work, that this is a genuine being in the film. It's not a human dressed up in a costume from a costume store. Almost ironically, it's actually something else dressed up as a creature that appears to look like Bigfoot. So I think what we're going to discuss in the After Hours episode is number one, additional remote viewing work, which goes over where does the thing come from. And number two, who's behind the actual appearance of the creature to begin with. And I got a lot of very peculiar data about that. And it's a little bit of a Wizard of Oz. I describe this life form as being like a marionette of something else. Well, we'll get into that data. And then finally, I think I'll also discuss some of the more peculiar mechanics about what's also at the site with the actual life form that we didn't go into.
I'm looking forward to the Scooby-Doo reveal where we pull off the Bigfoot head and underneath it's...
What's the guy's name? Who it always is? Yeah, so I think we'll do that in the After Hours, but that concludes the main show. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this next Cypher adventure. Fascinating exploration. Thank you, Emily, for picking this topic. And if you would like to join us in the next hour, you can go to our website on remoteviewingpodcast.com or cypher.com. Links will be in the description below, where you can join us on the continued exploration of the Patterson-Gimlin film. And so with that, we're going to wrap this up. Take care, everybody. Until next time.